Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are dissecting a modern phenomenon in the world of personal finance, The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. And well, the central question we are grappling with is deceptively simple, yet it really tears at the very fabric of the financial industry. Is financial success a hard skill, meaning a result of mathematical precision, data analysis, and market timing, or is it, as Housel posits, a soft skill? A game of psychology, behavior, and emotional management, where how you behave matters significantly more than what you actually know.
It is a question that fundamentally divides the room. On one side, you have the quantitative analysts, the economists, the engineers, the people who believe in optimization, efficiency, and the raw power of compound interest calculations. And on the other, you have the behavioralists who believe that finance is, well, mostly feelings.
Money has a little to do with how smart you are and everything to do with how you behave. Housel argues that finance isn't physics. It is not a rigid science with laws that never change.
Right. It's a study of human behavior, and humans are messy.
Exactly. You can be a genius and go completely broke. You can be an ordinary person and retire wealthy. That just doesn't happen in fields like neurosurgery or structural engineering. You don't see a janitor accidentally performing a successful heart transplant just because he had, patience.
And that is exactly where I start to get skeptical. I admit, the source material is incredibly popular. It makes people feel good about their lack of financial rigor. But my position today is that true wealth generation, the kind that actually changes family trajectories, requires aggressive optimization and mathematical rationality. I challenge the premise that behavior is a sufficient substitute for analytical excellence.
And I represent the position that wealth is primarily a product of survival, patience, and the management of one's own psychology. If you cannot master your behavior, the math simply does not matter. You can have the best algorithm in the world, but if you panic and sell at the bottom, the algorithm fails.
Purely as a psychological game, you risk excusing mediocrity. Relying on being reasonable, as Housel suggests, is often just a euphemism for failing to maximize your potential. The math does matter, and ignoring it for the sake of comfort is a luxury most cannot afford.
Well, let's get right into the evidence then. Housel opens with a comparison that I think grounds this entire discussion, and it really highlights the soft skills thesis. Ronald Read versus Richard Fiscone.
Ah, yes, the janitor and the executive.
Exactly. Ronald Read was a janitor and a gas station attendant in Vermont. He lived a very quiet life, fixed cars, swept floors, chopped wood, and died at age 92. When he died, he shocked everyone, including his own family, by leaving an estate worth over $8 million to his local library and hospital. He didn't win the lottery, he just saved consistently and waited.
It's a charming anecdote, I'll give you that. It fits the behavioral narrative perfectly.
It's data. But then you have Richard Fiscone, Harvard-educated Merrill Lynch executive, retired in his 40s to become a philanthropist. He had absolutely everything Ronald Read didn't: education, status, high income. He was the very definition of a hard-skill financial expert. But Fiscone was leveraged. He was greedy. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, he went bankrupt. The foreclosure of his massive Greenwich mansion was national news. The janitor beat the Harvard MBA. Housel's point is that there is no other field where a novice with zero training can outperform a disastrous expert. It proves that financial success is not about intelligence, it's about behavior.
Hold on. You're using two extreme outliers to define a rule. That is bad science. Ronald Read is an absolute statistical anomaly, a tail event in himself. For every janitor who saves $8 million, there are millions who retire in poverty. And for every Richard Fiscone who blows it, there are thousands of MBAs who manage risk perfectly well. My issue with the soft skill thesis is that it completely ignores the structural advantages of intelligence and data.
But Housel addresses that cognitive gap. He argues we are all anchored to our history. It's the idea that our personal experience makes up about 0.0000001% of what happens in the world, but it makes up 80% of how we think the world works.
The no one's crazy concept.
Yes. If you grew up in the Great Depression, your view of the stock market is fundamentally different from someone who grew up during the tech boom of the late 90s. That isn't a bias you can just turn off with a spreadsheet.
I agree that the bias exists, but that is a description of a cognitive flaw, not a strategy for wealth. Just because we are anchored to our past doesn't mean we should be. The goal of a sophisticated investor is to overcome that bias, not coddle it. If you were investing based on the trauma of your childhood rather than the forward PE ratio of the S&P 500, you are going to lose. You are essentially arguing that we should let our emotional baggage drive the car.
I'm arguing that you can't even drive the car if you deny the baggage is in the trunk. But let's look at the actual mechanism of wealth itself, compounding. Housel uses a brilliant analogy about the ice ages to explain this. Geologists used to think you needed these massive, cataclysmic, cold winters to create an ice sheet. They were looking for a dramatic event. But it turns out you just need cool summers.
Explain that connection for the listener, because it sounds like we're debating geology now, not finance.
Fair enough. If the summer isn't hot enough to melt the previous winter's snow, the snow stays. The next winter, more snow falls on top of it. It reflects more sunlight, which cools the Earth further. Over thousands of years, that layering creates a continental ice sheet. The cool summer is the behavior that prevents you from interrupting the compounding. You don't need the catastrophe of a massive lucky break or a huge salary. You just need small returns uninterrupted for a very long time. Success is about survival. It's about sticking around long enough for that snow to pile up.
It's a poetic analogy. But here is the fatal flaw in the cool summer theory. While you are focusing on the snow piling up inch by inch, you are entirely ignoring the mathematical reality of tails. Housel himself discusses this in the chapter Tails You Win. He cites the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule. In finance, a tiny number of events account for the vast majority of outcomes.
He does acknowledge that, yes. He says you can be wrong half the time and still make a fortune.
He acknowledges it, but his advice contradicts it. Look at the data he provides. The Russell 3000 index increased more than 50-fold over a few decades. That sounds like great compounding, right? But look closer. 40% of the companies in that index effectively failed. The entire return of the index came from just 7% of the components, the extreme outliers like Apple or Amazon.
Which argues strongly for broad diversification, does it not?
No, it argues that survival isn't enough. If you miss those 7% of companies because you were playing it safe, or because you were too reasonable to take a risk, your returns are zero. You can be wrong half the time and still make a fortune, but only if you are mathematically aggressive enough to capture the outliers. If you prioritize cool summers and safety, you miss the explosive growth that actually drives wealth. The soft skill approach risks insulating you from the very volatility required to generate high returns. You are building a little snowball while everyone else is building an avalanche.
And that brings us directly to our first core point of contention today, the battle between being reasonable versus being rational. This is where the rubber really meets the road.
And this is exactly where I think Housel's argument is most dangerous to the average listener.
Or most profound. Hauser argues that aiming to be mostly reasonable works far better than trying to be coldly rational. He uses the example of a fever. Biologically, a fever is a rational defense mechanism. It heats up the body to kill an infection. So a purely rational doctor would say, never take Tylenol. Let the fever burn. It is optimizing the immune response.
Correct. That is the scientifically optimal path. If you want to kill the virus quickly, you let the heat rise.
But we take Tylenol anyway. Why? Because fevers hurt. They make us miserable. We want to sleep. Taking Tylenol is reasonable even if it's not medically rational because it technically extends the illness slightly. Household applies this directly to money. Take paying off a low-interest mortgage. Mathematically, it makes 0 sense. You could borrow at 3% and invest in the market at an average of 8%. The spread is free money. A rational spreadsheet says never, ever pay off the debt.
And the spreadsheet is right. If you pay off a 3% mortgage when inflation is 4%, you are literally lighting value on fire. You are destroying capital.
But what if having that debt stresses you out? What if it depletes your ego? If the market crashes and you lose your job, the rational investor with the mortgage and the stocks is under maximum pressure. They might panic and sell the stocks at the bottom just to pay the mortgage. The reasonable investor who paid off the house has a lower burn rate. They can sleep at night. They don't sell their stocks. They survive.
The reasonable move protects your psychology so you can stay in the game.
That is a compelling narrative, but have you considered the actual cost of that comfort? You are essentially paying a sleep tax. You are sacrificing maximum utility, potentially hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars over a lifetime, just to assuage your own cognitive dissonance. The job of a serious individual investor should be to train themselves to be rational, not to lower the bar to what feels good. If you are leaving a 5% arbitrage on the table because you feel anxious, you don't need a financial advisor. You need a therapist.
But humans aren't spreadsheets. We have what behavioral scientists call ego depletion. You cannot be rational 24/7. Morgan Housel argues that if you love your investments, if they give you a sense of reasonable comfort, you will actually stick with them when things get tough. The purely rational strategy that you abandon in a crisis is utterly useless. The suboptimal strategy that you can stick with is superior.
The guy driving a Ferrari, you don't think, wow, that guy's cool. You think, I would look cool in that car. He argues we should stop buying stuff to impress people because no one actually cares about us. And sure, that's true. But humans are social creatures driven by status. Pretending we can simply turn off that biological drive to be reasonable is totally unrealistic. I'd argue that sleeping at night is highly overrated if you wake up knowing you left 50% of your potential net worth on the table because you were too afraid to leverage cheap debt.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it assumes you can maintain that cold rationality when the market drops 50%. Everyone is a long-term investor until the market crashes. That's when the reasonable investor who paid off their house stays the course, while the rational investor who maximized leverage panics.
Which leads us to the distinction between getting wealthy and staying wealthy. Housel claims these are two completely distinct skills.
They absolutely are. Getting wealthy requires optimism. It requires risk. It requires swinging for the fences, capturing those tail events you mentioned. But staying wealthy? That requires the exact opposite. It requires paranoia. It requires frugality. It requires an acceptance that what you made can be rapidly taken away.
But there is a glaring contradiction in the source material here regarding luck and risk. Housel spends a lot of time discussing Bill Gates versus Kent Evans.
Right, a very tragic story.
For those who aren't familiar, Bill Gates attended Lakeside School, which was one of the only high schools in the world with a computer terminal in 1968. That is a 1 in a million stroke of luck. But his friend, Kent Evans, was just as smart and just as ambitious. He likely would have been a founding partner of Microsoft, but Kent died in a mountaineering accident before graduation, a 1 in a million stroke of bad luck.
Exactly. Luck and risk are doppelgangers. They are the exact same force working in opposite directions.
And here's my problem with that. Housel uses this to advise paranoia. But if getting wealthy was largely a result of a tail event, luck, like Gates at Lakeside, then believing you can control keeping it through paranoia is just an illusion of control. If tails drive everything, then staying wealthy through extreme conservatism is actually a losing strategy. You are actively minimizing your exposure to the next positive tail event.
No, you are ensuring you are still in the game for the next tail event. Look at the example of Jesse Livermore versus Abraham Jermensky. Jesse Livermore was one of the greatest stock traders in history. He shorted the market before the 1929 crash and made a fortune. He was worth $100 million in 1929 dollars. He had the getting rich skill down perfectly. He was a genius of optimization, but he didn't have the staying rich skill.
Because he kept gambling.
Because he didn't have a stop switch. He kept taking massive risks, brimming with confidence, and eventually lost it all and took his own life. Compare that to Abraham Jermensky, a multimillionaire real estate developer who did the exact same thing, bet big, lost everything in the crash, and disappeared. The goal is to be financially unbreakable. You need a margin of safety. You need to be paranoid so that you don't get wiped out before the long term kicks in. If you are wiped out, the opportunity cost is infinite.
I see the mathematical value in a margin of safety. I do. But Housel advocates for a concept of enough. He warns against the hedonic treadmill, the idea that as soon as you get money, you just want more. He says you need to stop the goalposts from moving. I argue that never having enough is the actual engine of civilization. Innovation happens because people didn't think they had enough.
If Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos had decided they had enough after their first 100 million, we wouldn't have the technologies we have today. Housel's advice to aim for enough is a recipe for personal and societal stagnation. It's a philosophy for retirees, not builders.
That is a very cynical interpretation of the text. He isn't saying stop working or stop innovating. He's saying stop risking what you need for what you don't need. Remember the story of Rajat Gupta?
The former McKinsey CEO?
Yes. Rajat Gupta was worth $100 million. By any reasonable standard, he had enough. He had freedom, an impeccable reputation, and immense wealth. But he was jealous of the billionaires he surrounded himself with. He wanted to be in the 3 comma club. So he engaged in insider trading, went to federal prison, and completely ruined his reputation. He risked the things that were truly invaluable, freedom and reputation, for something that was just extra utility. That is not rational. That is madness. Enough is simply the realization that there is no utility in the extra dollar if it costs you something you cannot replace.
Fair point on Gupta. That was criminal stupidity, not just aggressive optimization. But let's pivot to what this wealth is actually for, the definition of wealth itself. Housel argues that the highest dividend money pays is not cars or houses, but control over your time.
Absolutely. And he backs this up with hard data. The Mindfulness Muse source cites a study by the American Psychological Association covering 63 countries. They found that individualism and autonomy are much better predictors of well-being than money. Once you cover your basic needs, the correlation between income and happiness plateaus, often cited around $75,000 a year, adjusted for inflation, of course. Real wealth is the ability to say, I can do what I want, when I want, with whom I want.
It is a very pleasant narrative. It sounds lovely. I just want to be free.
It's not just a narrative. It's the functional definition of freedom. Housel makes a vital distinction here. Wealth is what you don't see. Rich is a current income. You see the car, you see the house. Wealth is income not spent. It's the unspent options sitting in your brokerage account that give you the ability to walk away from a toxic job or handle a medical emergency without a second of panic.
Wealth is what you don't see? You know who really loves that definition? People who don't have anything to show. It is a highly convenient story. Housel himself writes that stories are more powerful than statistics. I argue that he is spinning a comforting story that makes ordinary people feel much better about not being rich. Oh, I'm not poor. I just have invisible wealth.
That is unnecessarily harsh, and it misses the point.
It's realistic. We live in a physical world. But I will make a concession here. Housel talks about the surprise factor, the idea that history is a poor predictor of the future because the most important events are things that have never happened before, the unknown unknowns.
Exactly. History is the study of surprising events. If you rely purely on historical data models, like your beloved optimization spreadsheets, you are driving looking strictly in the rearview mirror.
Right, and if we accept that the future is fundamentally unknowable, then perhaps your preference for options, for piles of unspent cash, has some merit. Not because of some spiritual freedom woo-woo, but because cash is the most agile asset when a structural change occurs. If you are fully invested in optimized, rational assets and the macroeconomic world changes overnight, you are illiquid. So I will grant that invisible wealth has a strategic utility.
I am glad we finally found some common ground, even if you arrive there through cold strategy. And this swings right back to the save money chapter. You don't save for a car, you don't save for a house, you save just to save. You save for a world where luck and risk are entirely unpredictable variables.
I can agree with saving for liquidity, but I still struggle with the idea that we should abandon optimization entirely. Housel talks about the end of history illusion. We realize we changed in the past, but we mistakenly think our current selves are the finished product.
Right. You might be willing to work 80 hours a week right now to maximize those tails you love so much. But in 10 years, you might just want to watch your kids grow up. If you locked yourself into a high-burn lifestyle because you are optimizing for a high income, you are trapped. Flexibility is the ultimate wealth because it accounts for the simple fact that you don't know who you will be in 10 years.
But if you didn't optimize early, you won't have the capital to support that future family anyway. It's a circular argument. If you spend your 20s being reasonable and safe, you arrive at your 40s with a peaceful mind and a completely empty wallet.
Not empty. Compounded. Remember the ice sheet.
Glacial.
Reliable.
And that brings us to the conclusion of the material today. The math is easy. We have the calculators, we have the algorithms. Anyone can learn to calculate a discounted cash flow, but the behavior is hard. Enough is not too little. It is a shield against regret. The most important variable in the entire equation is time. And the only way to maximize time, to let that compounding snow pile up, is to survive the short-term volatility. You survive by being reasonable, by managing your psychology, and by not trying to be a hero on a spreadsheet.
And I maintain that while psychology is absolutely valid, it should never replace ambition. Room for error, household's margin of safety, is necessary. I admit that. But do not use psychology as an excuse for financial lethargy. Do not tell yourself you are just being reasonable when you are actually just afraid of the hard work required to capture the tails. You cannot just survive, you have to aim to win. The world is driven by the outliers, not the survivors.
But you have to survive to become an outlier. You cannot win if you are forced to quit the game.
Perhaps. But if you aim only for survival, that is all you will ever achieve.
We can agree on this at least. Money is a tool, not the goal itself. And as Housel writes in the chapter You and Me, understanding your own game is crucial. You might be playing a game of short-term optimization, while I am playing a game of long-term autonomy.
True. The absolute worst financial mistake is taking cues from someone playing a different game. If I'm a trader looking for alpha and you're a retiree looking for fixed income, your advice is poison to me.
Exactly. Know your game. Know your time horizon. And maybe, just maybe, be a little kinder to yourself when the numbers don't add up perfectly. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you for listening to The Debate.